They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes the people who share your bloodline can cut you deeper than any stranger ever could. What happened to me last Christmas changed everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and the power of staying silent when you should speak up. This isn't just a story about holiday drama or family dysfunction. This is about what happens when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, your humility for helplessness, and your love for stupidity. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't anger or revenge. It's simply the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, though most people these days just call me Mrs. H. I'm 73 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I shared 47 years of marriage with the most wonderful man who ever walked this earth. Harold passed on a Tuesday morning in June, peaceful as you please, holding my hand while the morning sun streamed through our bedroom window. The doctors said his heart just gave out, but I knew better. Harold had been ready to go for months, ever since the cancer took away his ability to tend his garden and fix things around the house. He was never a man who could sit still. People always assume that being a widow means you're automatically lonely, helpless, or desperate for company. They look at you with those pitying eyes and speak in hushed tones, as if grief has made you fragile as spun glass. But Harold and I, we built something solid together. We built a life, a business, and yes, we built wealth, though you'd never know it to look at me. I still shop at the same grocery store I've been going to for 30 years. I still drive the same reliable Honda Civic Harold bought me in 2019, and I still live in the same modest 3-bedroom house we bought when our son Michael was just 5 years old. You see, Harold and I learned early in our marriage that money changes people, and not always for the better. We watched friends and family members transform the moment they got a taste of success. We saw marriages crumble under the weight of greed and children who felt entitled to their parents' hard work before they'd even finished college. So we made a pact. We would live simply, work hard, and keep our financial business to ourselves. The only person who knew the full extent of our success was our accountant, and even he only saw pieces of the puzzle. Harold started Hartwell Financial Services in 1981 with a small business loan and a dream of helping working families buy their first homes. Back then, getting a mortgage was like navigating a maze blindfolded, especially if you didn't have perfect credit or a substantial down payment. Harold saw an opportunity to be different. He wanted to be the kind of lender who actually listened to people's stories, who understood that sometimes good people hit rough patches, and who believed that everyone deserved a chance at the American dream. What started as a small mortgage brokerage grew into something much larger. By the time Harold retired in 2018, Hartwell Financial had grown into one of the region's most respected mortgage companies, with over 200 employees and offices in 6 states. We specialized in working with first-time homebuyers, veterans, and families who might not qualify for traditional bank loans. Harold always said we weren't just selling mortgages, we were selling hope. The irony wasn't lost on me that while we were helping thousands of families achieve their dreams of home ownership, our own son seemed to struggle with basic financial responsibility. Michael is 42 years old, and despite our best efforts to teach him the value of hard work and careful planning, he's always been what Harold diplomatically called financially optimistic. Michael has a good heart, don't get me wrong. He's a loving father to his 2 children, Emma and Jack, ages 8 and 10 respectively. He works as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, making a decent living that should be more than enough to support his family comfortably. But Michael has always lived just slightly beyond his means. It started in college with credit card debt, continued through his 20s with car loans for vehicles he couldn't quite afford, and followed him into marriage with a wife who, it became clear over time, had expensive tastes and no particular interest in adjusting them to match their actual income, rather than their desired lifestyle. Cynthia. Even now, 6 months after what happened, I have to take a deep breath when I think about my daughter-in-law. When Michael first brought her home 8 years ago, I tried so hard to see what he saw in her. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of polished elegance that comes from expensive salons and designer clothes. She had a quick wit and could be charming when she wanted to be. But there was something underneath that charm that made me uneasy from the very beginning, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Harold, bless his heart, was more direct in his assessment. "That woman looks at people like they're price tags," he told me after their engagement party. "She's sizing everyone up, figuring out what they're worth to her." I told him he was being unfair, that maybe Cynthia was just nervous about fitting into our family. But Harold had an uncanny ability to read people, probably developed from years of sitting across from desperate home buyers and having to determine who was genuinely in need versus who was trying to take advantage of his generous nature. The warning signs were there from the beginning. But love makes you blind, and parental love might be the most blinding force of all. Michael was happy, or at least he seemed happy, and that was enough for me. I wanted to believe that Cynthia would grow into the role of daughter-in-law, that maybe she just needed time to understand our family's values and way of doing things. Their wedding was beautiful, but expensive. Far more expensive than Michael could afford on his salary. Harold and I quietly contributed $25,000 to help cover costs, money that Michael promised to pay back over time but never did. Not that we expected him to, really. Parents help their children. That's what we do. But it established a pattern that would continue throughout their marriage. Michael and Cynthia living slightly beyond their means, and Harold and I discreetly helping to fill the gaps. When Emma was born 2 years later, followed by Jack 18 months after that, I was hopeful that becoming parents would ground them both, give them a sense of responsibility and priority that had seemed missing before. And in some ways, it did. Michael threw himself into fatherhood with genuine enthusiasm, and even Cynthia seemed to soften around the edges when she was caring for the babies. But the financial pressures only increased. Childcare costs, medical bills, the decision to buy a house that was, once again, just slightly more than they could comfortably afford. They purchased a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in one of the better school districts, the kind of house that makes a statement about the family that lives there. The mortgage payments were manageable, Cynthia assured me, especially with the excellent interest rate they'd secured. What she didn't mention, and what I didn't learn until much later, was that they'd stretched themselves so thin to qualify for that mortgage that they had virtually no emergency fund, no cushion for unexpected expenses, and no margin for error, if Michael's income fluctuated or if any major repairs were needed. After Harold passed away, I found myself in a strange position. For the first time in decades, I was alone, but I was also, for the first time, fully aware of the extent of our financial success. Harold had always handled the business side of our investments and holdings, sharing the broad strokes with me but keeping me insulated from the day-to-day details. It was his way of protecting me, I suppose, though I often wondered if he was also protecting himself from my tendency to worry about money, even when there was no need to. Going through Harold's papers with our lawyer and accountant was like discovering a hidden room in a house you'd lived in your entire life. Our investment portfolio was substantial, but it was the business holdings that truly surprised me. Over the years, Harold had quietly acquired stakes in various financial services companies, including several smaller mortgage lenders that had been struggling during the recession. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had a talent for identifying good companies that were simply going through temporary difficulties, and he'd often step in with capital and guidance to help them get back on their feet. The crown jewel of these investments was something called Pinnacle Home Lending, a mid-sized mortgage company that Harold had essentially rescued from bankruptcy in 2014. What started as a loan to keep them afloat had evolved into full ownership over the years, as the original owners were unable to repay their debts and eventually signed the company over to Harold entirely. By the time of his death, Pinnacle Home Lending was processing over $500 million in mortgages annually and was one of the more profitable pieces of our portfolio. I share all of this background not to boast about our success, but because it's essential to understanding what happened next. When you spend your entire adult life living modestly and keeping your financial situation private, people make assumptions about your circumstances. Even your own family can forget that appearances aren't always reality, that the quiet grandmother who drives an old car and clips coupons might be harboring secrets that would astonish them. The first indication that this Christmas was going to be different came in the form of a phone call from Cynthia in early December. I was in the kitchen, making my afternoon tea and going through the mail, when the phone rang. Cynthia's voice had that artificially bright tone she used when she was about to ask for something or deliver news she knew I wouldn't like. "Eleanor," she began, and I noticed immediately that she didn't call me Mom or even Mrs. H, as she usually did. The use of my first name felt deliberate, a subtle establishment of distance. "I wanted to call and talk to you about Christmas plans this year. Every year since Emma and Jack were born, we'd celebrated Christmas at Michael and Cynthia's house. It made sense logically. They had the most space, and it was easier for the children to stay in their own home rather than disrupting their routine. Harold and I had always been happy to accommodate whatever arrangements worked best for the family. Christmas was about being together, not about who hosted or where we gathered." "Of course, dear," I said, settling into my kitchen chair with my tea. "What did you have in mind? Should I bring the green bean casserole again this year? Emma seemed to really enjoy it last time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that feels loaded with unspoken meaning. When Cynthia spoke again, her voice had lost some of its artificial brightness, replaced by something that sounded almost rehearsed. "Well, that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. This year is going to be a little different. We're having some work done on the dining room, and the whole downstairs is basically a construction zone right now. Plus, with both kids being older now, we're hoping to create more of an intimate family celebration. Just the four of us, you know?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach, though I couldn't quite identify what it was yet. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I see. So you'd prefer to celebrate separately this year?" No, that's not what I'm saying at all," Cynthia said quickly, though there was something in her tone that suggested she'd been hoping I'd come to that conclusion on my own. "We absolutely want you to be part of Christmas. It's just that we need to be creative about the logistics this year." "Creative how?" Another pause. "Well, the dining room is completely unusable right now, and the kitchen table only seats 4 people comfortably. But Michael had this great idea. We could set up a nice little area for you in the garage. It's heated, and we could make it really cozy with some Christmas decorations. That way you could still be part of the celebration, but we'd have enough space for everyone to be comfortable." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't speak at all. The garage. She wanted me to eat Christmas dinner in the garage. "Eleanor, are you still there?" I realized I'd been silent for too long. "Yes, I'm here. I'm just trying to make sure I understand correctly. You want me to eat Christmas dinner in your garage?" "It's not like that," Cynthia said, and now there was a defensive edge to her voice. "It's not like we're banishing you or anything. The garage is perfectly comfortable, and honestly, it might be quieter and more peaceful for you. Sometimes the kids can get pretty loud during dinner, and I know how much you value a calm environment." The manipulation in that statement was breathtaking. She was presenting my exile to the garage as a favor she was doing for me, a consideration of my preferences rather than her convenience, and somehow she was making it sound like it was Michael's idea, though I had serious doubts about that. "What does Michael think about this arrangement?" I asked. "Oh, he's completely on board. In fact, he was the one who suggested it. He knows how important it is for us to maintain family traditions, even when we have to adapt to challenging circumstances. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Everything in me wanted to respond with anger, to ask her if she'd lost her mind, to demand to speak to Michael directly. But something held me back. Maybe it was the habit of a lifetime of avoiding confrontation, or maybe it was the shock of hearing something so outrageous presented as reasonable. Whatever it was, I found myself responding with a calmness that surprised even me. "I appreciate you thinking of ways to include me," I said carefully. "But I have to admit, this is quite a surprise. In all my years, I've never heard of anyone eating Christmas dinner in a garage." "Times change, Eleanor. Families have to be flexible and willing to adapt. I just think it's important that we all make some compromises so that the day can be special for everyone, especially the children." There it was again, the subtle implication that by objecting to eating in the garage, I would somehow be ruining Christmas for Emma and Jack. It was masterful manipulation, really. Cynthia had found a way to make me the selfish one for not eagerly embracing my banishment from the family table. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course," Cynthia said, though I could hear the irritation she was trying to hide. "Just let us know as soon as possible so we can plan accordingly. Christmas is only 2 weeks away." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall where Harold and I had hung family photos spanning nearly 5 decades of marriage. Pictures of Michael as a baby, as a little boy, graduating from high school and college. His wedding, photos, where he looked so happy and hopeful. Pictures of Emma and Jack from every birthday and holiday since they were born. I thought about Harold and what he would say if he were here. I could almost hear his voice, gruff with indignation. "Eleanor, that woman is testing you. She's seeing exactly how much disrespect you'll tolerate before you stand up for yourself." But I also heard the voice of the woman I'd been for most of my adult life, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over family tensions and made excuses for bad behavior in the name of keeping everyone happy. That voice whispered that maybe Cynthia was right. Maybe the dining room really was under construction. Maybe this was just a temporary inconvenience that I should graciously accept for the sake of family harmony. Over the next few days, I found myself analyzing every interaction I'd had with Cynthia over the past 8 years, looking for clues I might have missed, patterns I might have ignored. There was the time she'd invited everyone to Emma's birthday party except me, claiming she'd assumed Michael had already told me about it. The occasions when she'd planned family outings during times when she knew I had other commitments, then expressed disappointment that I couldn't join them. The way she had of asking my opinion about something and then explaining why my perspective was outdated or impractical. I remembered the previous Christmas, when I'd brought homemade cookies for the children, and Cynthia had quietly thrown them away later, explaining to Michael within my earshot that store-bought cookies were more hygienic, and she couldn't be sure what kind of ingredients I'd used in my kitchen. I'd been hurt but had told myself she was just being cautious, that maybe she was worried about food allergies or contamination. But now, looking back with the clarity that comes from having your eyes suddenly opened, I could see a pattern of small cruelties, subtle exclusions, and calculated disrespect that had been building for years. The garage invitation wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural progression of behavior that had been escalating gradually, so gradually that I'd failed to recognize it for what it was. 3 days before Christmas, I called Michael at work. I rarely bothered him during business hours, but I felt like I needed to hear his version of the Christmas plan directly from him, without Cynthia's interpretation. "Mom, hi," he said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice that reminded me so much of Harold. "How are you doing? Are you getting excited for Christmas?" "I'm doing well, sweetheart. I was actually calling to talk to you about Christmas plans. Cynthia mentioned that you're having some construction work done." There was a pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had changed subtly. He sounded suddenly cautious, like someone walking through a minefield. "Yeah, the dining room. It's been a real mess. We probably should have waited until after the holidays to start the project, but the contractor had an opening in his schedule, and you know how hard it is to find good people. What kind of work are you having done? Another pause. Just some updates, new flooring, maybe some built-in cabinets. Nothing too dramatic, but it makes the whole area unusable right now. I could hear something in his voice that didn't ring quite true, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Michael had always been a terrible liar, even as a child. When he was trying to hide something, his voice would get slightly higher and he'd provide too many unnecessary details, as if extra information would make his story more believable. Cynthia mentioned that you had the idea for me to eat in the garage on Christmas Day. The silence that followed was so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Well, we were just trying to figure out how to make everything work. The garage is actually pretty comfortable, and we thought— Michael, I interrupted gently. Whose idea was it? Another long pause. Mom, it doesn't matter whose idea it was. We're all just trying to make the best of a difficult situation. That was when I knew. My son, the boy I'd raised to be honest and direct, was lying to me to protect his wife's feelings, even when doing so meant hurting mine. The realization was more painful than anything Cynthia had said or done. She was behaving according to her nature, but Michael was betraying his. I understand, I said quietly. I'll see you on Christmas Day. Mom, are you okay with the arrangement? I know it's not ideal, but— It's fine, Michael. I'll adapt. After I hung up, I sat in Harold's chair in the living room and allowed myself to cry for the first time since his funeral. I wasn't just crying for the humiliation of being asked to eat in a garage, or even for the loneliness of spending the first Christmas without my husband. I was crying for the loss of illusions I'd been clinging to, the comfortable fiction that my son's marriage was just going through normal growing pains, that Cynthia would eventually accept me as family, that love and patience would eventually win out over whatever was driving her behavior. But as I sat there in the gathering December dusk, something else began to emerge alongside the sadness. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. It took me a while to identify it, but when I finally did, it surprised me. It was anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that leads to shouting matches and slammed doors, but something colder and more focused. The kind of anger that comes from finally seeing clearly, from recognizing that your kindness has been mistaken for weakness and your love has been taken for granted. The kind of anger that doesn't seek immediate satisfaction, but instead begins to plan. I thought about Harold's words, spoken years ago but suddenly relevant. Eleanor, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the consequences of their choices. That night, I made a decision. I would go to Christmas dinner. I would eat in the garage if that's what was required, but I would also do something I'd never done before in my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. I would start paying attention, real attention, to their finances, their situation, their vulnerabilities. Because if this was how they chose to treat family, if this was the level of respect they thought I deserved, then maybe it was time they learned exactly who they were dealing with. I pulled out Harold's address book and found the number for James Morrison, our family lawyer. If I was going to start paying attention to Michael and Cynthia's situation, I wanted to do it properly, with full knowledge of where they stood financially. It was time to stop being the naive grandmother who assumed the best of everyone and start being the businesswoman Harold had trained me to be over 47 years of marriage. James answered on the third ring, his voice warm with recognition, when I identified myself. Eleanor, how good to hear from you. How are you holding up? I'm doing well, James. I was wondering if you could help me with something. I need information about a mortgage. Of course. What can I do for you? I gave him Michael and Cynthia's address and asked him to find out everything he could about their mortgage situation. who held their loan, what their payment history looked like, whether they were current on their obligations. James asked a few questions about why I needed the information, but when I explained that I was concerned about my son's financial stability and wanted to be prepared to help if necessary, he agreed to look into it discreetly. "I should have some information for you within a few days," he said. "I'll call you as soon as I know something." That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like I was taking action instead of simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. I had no idea what James would discover, or what I would do with whatever information he uncovered. But I knew that knowledge was power, and after years of operating from a position of assumed powerlessness in my relationship with Cynthia, I was ready to see what it felt like to hold some cards of my own. Christmas was 5 days away, and I intended to spend them preparing for what might be the most important family dinner of my life. Not because of what I would eat or where I would sit, but because of what I might finally be ready to say. James. Morrison called me back on December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas. I was in the middle of wrapping presents for Emma and Jack when the phone rang, and something in his tone immediately told me that what he'd discovered was significant. "Eleanor, I have the information you requested about your son's mortgage situation. Are you sitting down?" I lowered myself into Harold's chair, the wrapped toys forgotten on the coffee table. "What did you find?" "Your son and daughter-in-law's mortgage is held by Pinnacle Home Lending. Their original loan was processed in 2019, and according to the records I was able to access, they've been struggling with payments for the better part of 2 years. They're currently 4 months behind, and the foreclosure process has already begun." The irony hit me like a physical blow. Pinnacle Home Lending, the mortgage company that Harold had acquired, and that I now owned completely. My son was about to lose his house to a company that belonged to me, and neither he nor Cynthia had any idea. "How bad is their situation?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "It's serious, Eleanor. They owe approximately $18,000 in back payments, plus fees and interest. Without a significant payment very soon, they'll lose the house within the next 60 to 90 days. The foreclosure notice was filed 3 weeks ago." I closed my eyes and tried to process what this meant. Michael and Cynthia were facing the loss of their home, the disruption of their children's lives, financial ruin, and the shame that comes with foreclosure. And instead of reaching out to family for help, instead of swallowing their pride and asking for assistance, Cynthia had decided that this was the perfect time to humiliate me by making me eat Christmas dinner in their garage. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked. "There's one more thing. According to the payment history, they've been making partial payments sporadically, but never enough to stay current. It looks like they've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for quite some time. Credit card debt, a second mortgage they took out. 2 years ago, car payments. They're leveraged to the hilt." After I hung up with James, I sat in the quiet of my living room and tried to understand what I was feeling. There was sadness, certainly, for the stress my son must be under, for the uncertainty Emma and Jack were probably sensing even if they didn't understand its source. There was anger at Cynthia for creating this situation through years of overspending and then compounding it by treating me with such contempt. But underneath it all was something else, a sense of destiny, as if everything that had happened over the past few months had been leading to this moment. Harold always believed that the universe had a way of balancing the scales, that people who treated others poorly eventually faced consequences for their actions. He used to say that kindness was never wasted, but neither was cruelty. Both had a way of coming back to their source when you least expected it. I spent Christmas Eve in quiet preparation. I wrapped the remaining presents, prepared a side dish to bring to dinner the next day, and chose my outfit carefully. I wanted to look dignified, but not overdressed, grandmother-like, but not frail. I had a feeling that tomorrow was going to be a day that mattered, and I wanted to be ready for whatever it might bring. That evening, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and asked if she could do me a small favor. Mrs. Patterson was a retired legal secretary with a keen eye for detail and a talent for remembering conversations word for word. I asked her if she would be willing to stop by Michael and Cynthia's house around dinner time on Christmas Day, ostensibly to drop off some cookies for the children, but really to observe the situation and serve as a witness to whatever might unfold. Mrs. Patterson, who had never particularly liked Cynthia and had strong opinions about how families should treat their elders, readily agreed. "Eleanor, if that woman is treating you poorly, it's about time someone stood up to her. Harold would be spinning in his grave if he knew what was going on." Christmas morning dawned cold and gray, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. I dressed carefully in a navy wool dress that Harold had always said brought out my eyes, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw not the defeated widow that Cynthia probably expected, but the woman who had helped build a successful business from nothing and who had weathered every storm life had thrown at her for 73 years. I arrived at Michael and Cynthia's house at exactly 2 o'clock, as requested. The house looked the same as always from the outside. Well-maintained, expensive, the kind of home that announced its owner's aspirations to anyone driving by. But now that I knew what I knew about their financial situation, it looked different to me. It looked like a beautiful facade hiding a crumbling foundation. Michael answered the door with Emma and Jack at his sides, both children dressed in new Christmas outfits and practically vibrating with excitement. For a moment, seeing their innocent joy, I almost forgot why I was there. These were my grandchildren, and they deserved to have a wonderful Christmas regardless of what was happening between the adults in their lives. "Grandma Eleanor!" Emma squealed, launching herself into my arms. "Come see what Santa brought us." "In a minute, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tight and breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Let me say hello to your parents first." Michael hugged me, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders, see the strain around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Thanks for being flexible about dinner arrangements." Cynthia appeared from the kitchen, wearing a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her smile was bright and perfect, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, Merry Christmas. I'm so glad you could make it. Let me show you where we've set up your dining area." She led me through the house toward the garage, chattering about the weather and the children's presents as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I noticed that there was no evidence of construction in the dining room. No dust sheets, no tools, no displaced furniture. The beautiful mahogany table that had been a wedding gift from Harold and me sat exactly where it always had, set for 4 with their good china and crystal glasses. The garage had been cleaned and decorated with obvious effort. There was a small card table set up in one corner, covered with a tablecloth and set with paper plates and plastic utensils. A space heater hummed in the corner, fighting against the December cold seeping through the garage door. Christmas lights had been strung around the walls, and there was even a small artificial tree on a folding chair nearby. "See?" Cynthia said brightly. "It's actually quite cozy, and you'll have such peace and quiet out here. No kids running around or adults talking over each other. I think you're going to love it." I stood in that garage looking at the elaborate effort that had gone into making my exile seem festive and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't thoughtlessness or poor planning. This was deliberate. Cynthia had spent time and energy creating this setup, had put thought into how to make banishing me from the family table seem like a considerate gesture. The sheer calculation of it took my breath away. "It's very thoughtful," I said quietly. "You've clearly put a lot of effort into this." "Well, family is important," Cynthia replied, missing entirely the irony in her own words. "I'll bring your plate out in just a few minutes. We're almost ready to eat." She left me alone in the garage, and I sat down at the little card table, and tried to collect my thoughts. Through the door that connected the garage to the house, I could hear the sounds of family Christmas. Laughter, conversation, the clink of real silverware against real plates. Emma and Jack were telling Michael about their morning, their voices high with excitement. Someone had put Christmas music on, and I could hear Bing Crosby crooning about dreaming of a white Christmas. It was the sound of everything I'd been excluded from. A few minutes later, Cynthia appeared with a paper plate covered with a modest portion of turkey, stuffing, and vegetables. The food looked fine, but it was clearly the leftovers, the pieces that hadn't made the cut for the main table. She set it down in front of me with a plastic fork and a paper napkin. "There you go," she said cheerfully. "I hope you enjoy it. Michael's carving skills have really improved over the years." She started to leave, then turned back as if something had just occurred to her. "Oh, and Eleanor? After dinner, would you mind cleaning up out here? I know it's Christmas, but with the kids and everything, it would be such a help." She didn't wait for an answer, just smiled and disappeared back into the house, leaving me alone with my paper plate and the sound of my family celebrating Christmas without me. I sat there for several minutes, not eating, just listening. I could hear Michael laughing at something one of the children had said. I could hear Cynthia telling Jack to use his napkin. I could hear the ordinary sounds of a family meal, the kind I'd shared with Harold and Michael for decades, the kind I'd assumed I'd be sharing with my grandchildren for years to come. Instead, I was sitting in a garage. That's when Mrs. Patterson knocked on the front door. I heard Cynthia answer, heard her surprised voice saying, "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, what a lovely surprise." Then I heard Mrs. Patterson's clear, carrying voice explaining that she'd brought some cookies for the children and wondered if she could wish everyone a Merry Christmas. "Of course," Cynthia said, though I could detect a note of strain in her voice. "Please, come in. We were just having dinner." What happened next was exactly what I'd hoped for, though I hadn't dared to expect it would be quite so perfect. Mrs. Patterson, with the unerring instincts of someone who had spent 40 years taking depositions and recording testimonies, asked the simple question that cut right to the heart of the matter. "Where's Eleanor? I saw her car in the driveway, but I don't see her at the table." There was a pause, and I could practically feel Cynthia scrambling for an explanation that would sound reasonable to an outsider. "Oh, we set up a special area for her. More comfortable and quiet." "What kind of special area?" Mrs. Patterson asked, and I could hear the sharpness in her voice that had made her such an effective legal secretary. "Well, with the dining room renovation and space being tight." Cynthia's voice trailed off. "I don't see any renovation," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "Your dining room looks exactly the same as always. Where exactly is Eleanor eating Christmas? Dinner?" The silence that followed was the kind that feels dangerous, like the moment of stillness before a thunderstorm breaks. I could imagine Michael's discomfort, the children's confusion, Cynthia's growing panic as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under the scrutiny of someone who wasn't family and wasn't invested in maintaining polite fictions. "She's in the garage," Michael said quietly, and I could hear the shame in his voice. "The garage?" Mrs. Patterson's voice rose with genuine shock. "You have your 73-year-old mother-in-law eating Christmas dinner in the garage?" "It's not like that," Cynthia said quickly. "It's heated, and we decorated it, and she said she was fine with the arrangement." "She said she was fine. With it?" Mrs. Patterson repeated slowly, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice. "And you thought that was appropriate?" What followed was several minutes of Mrs. Patterson expressing exactly what she thought of people who would treat an elderly family member with such disrespect, especially on Christmas Day. Her voice carried clearly through the house, and I'm sure the entire family heard every word. She used phrases like absolutely disgraceful and common decency, and what Harold would think if he could see this. Finally, I heard Michael's voice, strained and defensive. "Mrs. Patterson, I think you should probably go. This is a family matter. You're absolutely right, Michael, Mrs. Patterson replied. This is a family matter, and the way you're treating your family is shameful. I heard the front door close, and then there was silence from inside the house. Not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a meal together, but the tense, uncomfortable silence of people who had just been forced to confront something they'd been trying to ignore. A few minutes later, Michael appeared in the garage doorway. His face was flushed, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Mom, I'm sorry about that. Mrs. Patterson had no right to interfere in our family business. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honorable and kind, and felt a sadness so deep, it was almost physical. Michael, do you think Mrs. Patterson was wrong about what she said? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It's complicated, Mom. What's complicated about it? Cynthia feels like us. She feels like sometimes you judge the way we live, the choices we make. She thought maybe if you had some space, some distance, everyone would be more comfortable. I set down my plastic fork and looked at my son directly. Michael, I'm eating Christmas dinner in your garage off a paper plate, while the rest of the family eats in the dining room off your good china. In what world is this an appropriate way to treat anyone, let alone your mother? He didn't answer, but I could see in his face that Mrs. Patterson's words had hit their mark. For the first time, he was seeing the situation from the outside, through the eyes of someone who wasn't invested in making excuses for inexcusable behavior. I know things have been hard since Dad died, he said finally. And I know Cynthia can be particular about things. But she's not a bad person, Mom. She's just stressed about money and the house and everything we're dealing with right now. There it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. Michael had just given me the perfect opportunity to reveal what I knew about their situation, to offer help, to solve their problems, and potentially repair our family relationships in one generous gesture. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of sitting alone in this garage while my family celebrated without me. Maybe it was the realization that Cynthia's stress about money hadn't prevented her from spending time and energy on humiliating me. Maybe it was simply that I'd reached the end of my ability to make excuses for people who treated me poorly. What kind of money troubles? I asked, as if I didn't already know. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Just the usual stuff. Bills, mortgage payments, you know how it is. Are you behind on your mortgage payments? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched my son's face carefully. He wanted to lie. I could see it in his expression, but Harold had raised him, to be honest, and old habits die hard. A little behind, he admitted, but we're working it out. How far behind? Mom, I don't really want to discuss our finances. It's not your problem to solve. But it was my problem, wasn't it? Not just because I loved him and wanted to help, but because the company that held his mortgage belonged to me. Every missed payment, every late fee, every step closer to foreclosure was happening on my watch, under my ownership, while I sat in garages and made excuses for the people who were treating me like an unwelcome burden. Michael, I said carefully, if you needed help, financial help, would you ask me for it? He looked surprised by the question. Mom, I know you don't have that kind of money. You and Dad always lived so modestly and with Dad's medical bills and everything. It was fascinating, really, how completely wrong my own son was about my circumstances. Harold and I had been so successful in maintaining our modest lifestyle that even Michael, who should have known us better than anyone, had bought into the fiction that we were just getting by on a pension and Social Security. What if I did have that kind of money? I pressed. Would you ask for help, or would you let pride prevent you from reaching out to family? I guess I'd ask, he said slowly. But it would have to be pretty desperate circumstances. I gestured around the garage, with its space heater and card table and Christmas lights strung up to make my exile seem festive. More desperate than making your mother eat Christmas dinner in a garage. The color drained from Michael's face as the implication of my words sank in. For the first time, he was connecting his family's behavior toward me with their financial desperation, seeing the ugly irony of mistreating the one person who might actually be able to help them. Mom, this isn't about money. This is about space and construction and… Michael. My voice was quiet, but firm. There's no construction. Your dining room looks exactly the same as it always has. Mrs. Patterson saw it. I saw it, and most importantly, you know it. So please don't insult my intelligence by continuing to pretend otherwise. He slumped against the doorframe, looking suddenly older than his 42 years. You're right, there's no construction. Then why am I in your garage? The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken resentments and avoided confrontations. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice so low I had to strain to hear him. Because Cynthia said you make her uncomfortable. She said you look at our house, our things, our lifestyle, and she can tell you disapprove. She said having you at the table would ruin her enjoyment of Christmas, and that since it's our house, we should be able to enjoy the holiday without feeling judged. The honesty was brutal, but it was also liberating. Finally, we were past the pretenses and the polite fictions. Finally, we were talking about what was really happening. And you agreed with her? Michael looked miserable. I didn't know what else to do. She's my wife, Mom. This is her home too, and if she's not comfortable. So you chose her comfort over my dignity. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Michael. You had to choose between humiliating your mother and disappointing your wife, and you chose to humiliate your mother. That's what happened here, regardless of how you want to dress it up. I could see that my words were hitting their mark, that Michael was finally confronting the reality of what he'd allowed to happen. But I wasn't finished yet. You said Cynthia thinks I judge your lifestyle. What specifically does she think I disapprove of? She thinks you look down on us for spending money, for buying nice things, for not living like you and Dad did. And do you think that's fair? I don't know. Sometimes it seems like you don't understand that times are different now, that people have different priorities. I almost laughed at the irony of it. Here was my son, facing foreclosure on a house he couldn't afford, married to a woman who had just banished me to a garage, explaining to me that I didn't understand modern priorities. Michael, let me ask you something. If someone offered to pay off your mortgage tomorrow, to wipe out all your debt and give you a fresh start, what would you say? I'd say that's impossible. That kind of money doesn't just fall from the sky. But if it did, if someone you knew had that kind of money and was willing to help, what would you say? He looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion, as if he couldn't quite believe I was suggesting what I seemed to be suggesting. I'd say thank you. I'd say it was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for my family. And if that same person was sitting in your garage eating Christmas dinner off a paper plate while you and your wife celebrated inside, would that change your answer? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched understanding dawn in Michael's eyes. He was starting to realize that this conversation wasn't hypothetical, that there were layers to his family's situation that he hadn't even begun to understand. Mom, what are you saying? But before I could answer, Cynthia appeared in the doorway behind him, her face flushed and her voice sharp with irritation. Michael, what's taking so long? The kids want to open more presents and you're needed inside. She glanced at me dismissively. Eleanor, I hope you're enjoying your dinner. I put extra effort into making sure you had everything you needed. Out here. That was the moment I made my decision. Not in anger, though there was plenty of that. Not for revenge, though the symmetry would be perfect. but because sometimes the most important lessons can only be learned through experience. And sometimes love requires letting people face the consequences of their choices. "Cynthia," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I wonder if you could sit down for a moment. There's something I think you should know." She looked annoyed at the request, glancing back toward the house where Emma and Jack were probably getting impatient. "Can't it wait? We're in the middle of Christmas." "It's about your mortgage." The words had an immediate effect. Both Michael and Cynthia went very still, the kind of stillness that comes when someone mentions the exact thing you've been trying not to think about. "What about our mortgage?" Cynthia asked, trying to sound casual but not quite managing it. "I know you're behind on your payments. I know you're facing foreclosure. And I know you've been struggling with this for months without asking anyone for help." Michael and Cynthia exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to figure out how I'd learned about their situation. Cynthia recovered first, her face hardening into a defensive mask. "I don't know what you think you know, but our finances are none of your business." "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd brought with me, "they are my business, quite literally." I pulled out the documents James had prepared for me, copies of their mortgage paperwork, payment history, and foreclosure notices. But more importantly, I pulled out the ownership documents for Pinnacle Home Lending, the company that held their loan. "Your mortgage is held by Pinnacle Home Lending," I said quietly. "A company that my late husband acquired several years ago. A company that now belongs entirely to me." The silence that followed was profound. I could see Michael trying to process what I'd just told them, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning comprehension. Cynthia looked like she'd been slapped. "That's impossible," she said finally. "You don't have that kind of money. You drive a 10-year-old car and clip coupons. I drive a reliable car and I'm careful with money because that's how Harold and I built our wealth in the first place. We never spent money to impress people or to make ourselves feel important. We spent it on things that mattered, our business, our investments, our future security." I spread the documents out on the card table, next to my paper plate and plastic fork. "Your original mortgage was for $450,000. You've made sporadic payments for the past 2 years, but you currently owe $18,000 in back payments, plus fees and interest. The foreclosure process began 3 weeks ago." Michael sat down heavily in the folding chair next to my artificial Christmas tree. "Mom, I don't understand. If you own the mortgage company, if you've known about our situation, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you help us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since James had first called with the information. Because until 3 days ago, I didn't know. Harold always handled the business details, and it wasn't until I started looking into your situation that I discovered the connection. "Ma, but you know now," Cynthia said, and I could hear the calculation in her voice, the wheels turning as she tried to figure out how to use this information to her advantage. "You could fix this whole thing with one phone call." "I could. I agreed. The question is, why would I want to?" The bluntness of my response seemed to shock both of them. They'd clearly expected that learning about their situation would automatically trigger my maternal instincts, that I'd immediately rush to solve their problems without regard for how they'd been treating me. "Because we're family," Michael said, his voice pleading. "Because you love us." "I do love you, Michael. I love you more than you'll ever understand. But love doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. Love doesn't mean enabling people to treat you poorly without consequences." I gestured around the garage, with its pathetic attempt to make exile seem festive. "You asked me to eat Christmas dinner in your garage because your wife finds my presence uncomfortable. You lied to me about construction that doesn't exist. You allowed me to be humiliated in front of our neighbor rather than standing up for basic human decency. And now you want me to save your house?" "We didn't know," Cynthia said quickly. "We had no idea about your financial situation. If we'd known, If you'd known I had money, you would have treated me better? I asked. Is that really the defense you want to go with? The garage fell silent, except for the hum of the space heater and the distant sound of Christmas music from inside the house. Emma and Jack were probably wondering where the adults had gone, why Christmas had suddenly ground to a halt. What do you want from us? Michael asked finally. It was the right question, but I wasn't sure I was ready to answer it. What did I want? An apology? A promise to do better? Some guarantee that I'd never again be treated as less than family? Or did I want something more fundamental? A recognition that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly ultimately comes at a cost. That kindness and respect aren't luxuries to be dispensed based on someone's perceived value to you. I want you to think, I said finally. I want you to really consider what's happened here today, what choices you've made, and what kind of people you want to be. And then I want you to decide what you think you deserve from me. I stood up from the card table, leaving my barely touched dinner and the documents spread out like evidence at a crime scene. I'm going home now. When you've had time to think about what I've told you, when you've decided what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward, then we can talk about your mortgage. As I walked toward the door that led back into the house, Cynthia called after me. Eleanor, wait. We can work this out. We can fix this. I turned back to look at her. This woman who had spent years making me feel unwelcome in my own son's life, who had just spent Christmas Day making me eat in a garage while she enjoyed the warmth and comfort of the family table. Can we? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've had years to work this out. Years to decide what kind of family you wanted us to be. And your decision was to put me in a garage. I walked through their house, past the dining room where their good china sat half empty, past the living room where my grandchildren's presents lay scattered under a tree I'd helped buy, past the evidence of a life lived beyond their means, but with the expectation that somehow everything would work out. As I reached the front door, I heard Michael call my name, but I didn't stop. I had 73 years' worth of experience in making excuses for other people's behavior, in smoothing over conflicts, and pretending that hurtful actions didn't really matter. But Harold was gone, and with him had gone my willingness to accept. Less than I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. I drove home through the gray December afternoon, past houses where families were celebrating Christmas together, where grandparents were probably being treated with the respect and affection that should be automatic, not something you have to earn by proving your financial worth. When I got home, I sat in Harold's chair and looked at the pictures on our wall. Decades of family memories, Christmas mornings and birthday parties and ordinary moments that had seemed so precious when Harold was alive to share them with me. I thought about the choice I'd just made, the line I'd drawn, the stand I'd finally taken after years of quiet acceptance. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like myself again. Not the grieving widow, not the accommodating mother-in-law, not the elderly woman who could be safely ignored and disrespected. I felt like Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who had helped build a business from nothing, who had weathered every storm life had thrown at her, who had loved deeply and lost greatly, but who still had something left to give to the world. The question now was whether my son and daughter-in-law would prove themselves worthy of receiving it. The 3 days following Christmas passed in an unusual silence. My phone, which typically rang at least once daily with calls from Michael checking on my well-being or the children wanting to tell me about their day, remained stubbornly quiet. I found myself listening for it more than I cared to admit, wondering what conversations were taking place in my son's household, what arguments might be unfolding, what plans were being made. On the morning of December 28th, I decided to use this unexpected quiet time productively. I sat at Harold's desk in our home office, surrounded by financial documents and business papers that I'd been avoiding since his death, and began to truly understand the empire we'd built together. Harold had been meticulous in his record-keeping. And as I worked my way through files and folders, a picture emerged of investments and holdings that even I hadn't fully grasped. Beyond Pinnacle Home Lending, we owned stakes in 3 other financial services companies, a small chain of hardware stores that Harold had helped rescue during the recession, and a surprisingly valuable portfolio of commercial real estate. The numbers were staggering, even to me. We weren't just comfortable, we were genuinely wealthy. The kind of wealthy that could change multiple families' lives without making a significant dent in our overall holdings. But what struck me most as I reviewed Harold's careful documentation wasn't the magnitude of our success, but the thoughtfulness behind every investment. Harold hadn't been chasing profits for their own sake. He'd been investing in businesses that served their communities, that treated their employees fairly, that contributed something positive to the world. Every company we owned reflected our values, our belief that business could be a force for good when conducted with integrity and compassion. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Emma stood on my front porch, bundled in her pink winter coat and holding a piece of construction paper that had been folded into quarters. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and she looked nervous in a way that broke my heart. "Grandma Eleanor," she said when I opened the door, "I made you something." I knelt down to her level, ignoring the protest from my arthritic knees. "What did you make for me, sweetheart?" She unfolded the paper to reveal a crayon drawing of our family. There was Michael in his blue sweater, Cynthia in her red Christmas dress, Jack with his gap-toothed smile, and Emma herself with her blonde pigtails. But what caught my attention was the figure standing apart from the others, a woman with gray hair wearing a navy dress, positioned outside what appeared to be a house. "That's you," Emma explained, pointing to the solitary figure. "Mommy said you had to eat by yourself because there wasn't room at our table, but I didn't like that. Families are supposed to eat together." The innocence of her observation, the chum's simple clarity of an 8-year-old's understanding of right and wrong, nearly brought me to tears. Here was a child who instinctively understood what the adults in her life had somehow forgotten, that family members don't exclude each other, that love means making room at the table, not finding reasons to keep people away from it. Where did you get the idea to draw this picture, Emma? I heard Daddy and Mommy talking last night. They were using their quiet voices, the ones they use when they don't want me and Jack to hear. But I could still hear some of it. Daddy was sad, and Mommy was angry, and they kept saying your name. I invited Emma inside and made her hot chocolate while she told me, in the disconnected way children do, about the conversations she'd overheard. According to Emma, there had been several intense discussions between Michael and Cynthia since Christmas Day. Cynthia was angry that I'd tricked them by not revealing my financial situation earlier. Michael was struggling with guilt over how they'd treated me. Both of them seemed to be grappling with the reality that their housing situation was even more precarious than they'd realized. "Mommy said you own our house now," Emma said, stirring marshmallows into her cocoa. "Is that true?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that I found myself answering with the same honesty. "Not exactly, sweetheart. I own the company that loaned your parents money to buy your house. When people can't make their payments, sometimes they have to give the house back to the company." "Are we going to have to give our house back?" The fear in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that despite her parents' attempts to shield her from their financial stress, Emma was picking up on the anxiety that must have been permeating their household for months. "I don't know, Emma. That depends on a lot of things." "It depends on whether Mommy says she's sorry, doesn't it?" The perceptiveness of children never ceased to amaze me. In one simple question, Emma had cut through all the complexity and gotten to the heart of the matter. She understood, in a way that her mother apparently didn't, that this wasn't really about money or mortgages or business relationships. It was about respect, about apologies, about acknowledging when you've hurt someone and taking responsibility for making it right. After Emma left, delivered back to her parents by a neighbor who'd agreed to walk her over, I found myself thinking about patterns. Not just the pattern of Cynthia's treatment of me, but the larger pattern of how my family had operated for years. I began to see connections I'd previously missed, incidents I'd dismissed as isolated misunderstandings that were actually part of a much larger dynamic. I remembered Michael's graduation from college 20 years ago now. Harold and I had driven 6 hours to attend the ceremony, only to discover that Cynthia's family had been given our hotel room through some mix-up that left us scrambling to find accommodations at the last minute. We'd ended up staying at a roadside motel 40 minutes from campus, but we'd made the best of it, telling ourselves that these things happen and it wasn't worth making a fuss over. I remembered Emma's baptism, when Cynthia had somehow forgotten to include us in the family photos until Harold pointed out the oversight. We'd been added to a few shots at the end, but the professional photographer had already packed up most of his equipment, so the pictures of us were noticeably lower quality than the rest. I remembered countless birthday parties and school events, where we'd received invitations at the last minute, or where we'd been assigned to bring something specific, and then discovered that 3 other people had been asked to bring the same thing, creating an awkward abundance that made our contribution seem unnecessary. Individually, these incidents had seemed like honest mistakes, the kind of minor social friction that occurs in any family. But viewed as a pattern, they revealed something much more deliberate. Cynthia had been testing boundaries for years, seeing how much disrespect we would accept, how many small humiliations we would endure in the name of family harmony. And we had failed every test. Harold and I, in our desire to maintain peace and keep Michael happy, had enabled increasingly inappropriate behavior by making excuses for it, by convincing ourselves that Cynthia's actions were unintentional rather than calculated. We had taught her through our acceptance that we could be treated poorly without consequences. The garage dinner hadn't been an aberration. It had been the natural progression of a pattern that had been building for 8 years. That evening, I called my sister Margaret in Portland. Margaret was 5 years younger than me, but she'd always been the more direct of the two of us. Where I tended to smooth over conflicts, Margaret confronted them head-on. Where I made excuses for other people's behavior, Margaret held them accountable for their actions. "Eleanor," she said after I'd told her the whole story, "what took you so long?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been watching this situation develop for years, waiting for you to finally stand up to that woman. Every time we talked, you'd mention some new slight, some new way she'd managed to exclude you or diminish you, and I kept thinking, when is my sister going to stop making excuses and start demanding better treatment?" Margaret had never particularly liked Cynthia, but I'd assumed it was simple personality clash. Now I realized that Margaret, observing from a distance, had been able to see the pattern that I'd been too close to recognize. "You remember when Harold was sick?" Margaret continued. "When he was going through chemotherapy and you were exhausted from caring for him? Cynthia organized that family vacation to the beach house, the one she said was to help you relax and spend time with the grandchildren." I remembered. It had been presented as a generous gesture, a way for the family to support Harold and me during a difficult time. Cynthia had found a beautiful rental house, made all the arrangements, and insisted that we shouldn't worry about any of the details. You showed up to discover that she'd booked you and Harold into the basement room, with no windows and a pull-out sofa, while she and Michael got the master suite. She said it was because the basement was cooler and would be more comfortable for Harold. But you spent the entire week helping a sick man navigate steep stairs every time he needed to use the bathroom, because the basement only had a half bath. I had forgotten about the stairs, about how difficult that week had been for Harold, about how I'd spent most of our relaxing vacation worried about him falling or exhausting himself. At the time, I'd been so grateful that someone else was handling the logistics that I hadn't questioned the arrangements. Meanwhile, Margaret continued, Cynthia spent the week complaining about how tired she was from planning the trip, how stressful it was to coordinate everyone's schedules, how much work it was to manage a house full of people. she managed to make herself the victim of her own supposed generosity. The conversation with Margaret lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, I had a much clearer picture of the dynamic that had been operating in my family for years. Cynthia had a gift for positioning herself as simultaneously generous and put upon, for creating situations where she appeared to be helping while actually prioritizing her own comfort and convenience. And I had been complicit in it, so eager to maintain family unity that I'd consistently ignored red flags and rationalized unacceptable behavior. "So what are you going to do now?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to just pay off their mortgage and pretend none of this ever happened. It would be easier, and it would solve their immediate problem." Easier for whom? For everyone. For Michael, who's caught between his wife and his mother. For the children, who don't deserve to lose their home because of their parents' poor choices. Even for Cynthia, who would get what she needs without having to acknowledge what she's done. And what about you, Eleanor? Would it be easier for you? The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Would it be easier for me to simply resume my role as the accommodating mother-in-law, the one who caused no trouble and made no demands? Would it be easier to go back to making excuses for Cynthia's behavior and pretending that Christmas dinner in the garage had been a reasonable arrangement? "I think," I said slowly, "that easy isn't the same as right." "Now you're starting to sound like the sister I remember," Margaret said with satisfaction. "The one who helped Harold build a business from nothing because she wasn't afraid of doing hard things when they needed to be done." After I hung up with Margaret, I spent the evening going through photo albums and scrapbooks, looking at the visual record of my family's life over the past 8 years. The pictures told their own story, one that became clearer when viewed in sequence rather than individually. In the early photos, from Michael and Cynthia's engagement and wedding, I was prominently featured. Harold and I were in the center of family groupings, clearly valued and included. But as the years progressed, our positioning in photos gradually shifted. We moved from the center to the edges, from the front row to the back, from obvious inclusion to what appeared to be afterthought placement. In some of the more recent photos, Harold and I were barely visible, tucked into corners or partially obscured by other family members. In several pictures from last year's Christmas, we appeared to have been added at the last minute, our bodies angled awkwardly as we squeezed into shots that had been composed without us in mind. The visual evidence was damning in its consistency. This hadn't been a sudden change in family dynamics. It had been a gradual erosion of our place in the family hierarchy, so subtle that we hadn't recognized it as it was happening. On December 29th, I received my first communication from Michael since Christmas Day. It wasn't a phone call or a visit, but rather a text message that arrived while I was having breakfast. The message was brief and formal, so unlike Michael's usual warm communication style that I wondered if Cynthia had dictated it. "Mom, we need to talk about the situation. Can you come over today? We want to work this out." I stared at the message for a long time, analyzing every word choice. "We need to talk," rather than "I'd like to talk." The situation, rather than "what happened," or "how we treated you." "We want to work this out," rather than "we want to apologize," or "we want to make things right." Even in their request for reconciliation, they were maintaining emotional distance, avoiding acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and positioning the conversation as a negotiation between equal parties rather than an acknowledgement that they had behaved inappropriately and needed to make amends. I texted back a single word: "No." The response came immediately: "Mom, please, this is important." I typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "When you're ready to have a real conversation about what happened and why it was wrong, I'll be here. Until then, there's nothing to discuss." My phone remained silent for the rest of the day. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Harold's death. I cooked a full dinner for myself. Not the simple soups and sandwiches I'd been surviving. on, but a proper meal with multiple courses and attention to presentation. I set the dining room table with our good china and crystal, lit candles, and ate slowly while listening to the classical music that Harold had loved. It was a small act of self-care, but it felt significant. I was treating myself with the respect and consideration that I'd been missing from my family, demonstrating to myself that I was worth the effort of a properly prepared meal and an elegantly set table. As I cleaned up after dinner, I found myself thinking about power dynamics and how they shift within families over time. When Michael was young, Harold and I had held all the power, financial, emotional, and practical. We made the decisions that shaped his life, and he depended on us for everything from basic needs to major life guidance. Over the years, that dynamic had gradually shifted. As Michael became an adult, married, and had children of his own, the balance of power had changed. We were no longer the center of his universe, no longer his primary relationship, no longer the most important people in his daily life. That shift was natural and healthy. It's how families evolve as children grow up and create their own lives. But somewhere in that transition, I had allowed the pendulum to swing too far. In my eagerness to respect Michael's independence and avoid being the interfering mother-in-law, I had surrendered not just decision-making power, but also my right to basic consideration and respect. I had confused stepping back with stepping down, confused giving space with accepting disrespect. Now, for the first time in years, I held significant power again. Not just the emotional power that comes from being someone's mother, but real, practical power that could dramatically impact their lives. The question was how to use that power constructively, in a way that taught important lessons without causing unnecessary harm. On December 30th, Cynthia called me directly. I was surprised to see her name on my caller ID, since she typically communicated with me through Michael or not at all. Her voice was carefully controlled, with the kind of artificial pleasantness that suggested she was working from a script. "Eleanor, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out about the misunderstanding we had on Christmas Day." "What misunderstanding was that, Cynthia?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear her recalibrating. Clearly, she'd expected me to accept her characterization of our interaction as a simple misunderstanding rather than a deliberate act of disrespect. "The dinner arrangement," she said carefully. "I can see how it might have seemed inappropriate from your perspective, but I want you to understand that it wasn't intended that way." "How was it intended?" "Well, as I explained, we were dealing with space constraints and trying to accommodate everyone's needs. I thought the garage setup was actually quite thoughtful, quiet, private, decorated nicely. I was trying to give you a peaceful environment where you could enjoy your meal without the chaos of the children." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. Cynthia was not only refusing to acknowledge what she'd done, she was actively trying to convince me that banishing me to the garage had been a favor, a consideration of my preferences rather than an act of exclusion. "Cynthia," I said quietly, "there was no construction in your dining room." "Well, no, not active construction on that day, but we're planning renovations and—" "There was no construction planned. Your dining room looks exactly the same today as it did 6 months ago." Another pause. When Cynthia spoke again, her voice had lost some of its artificial sweetness. "Eleanor, I think you're being unreasonable about this. Families have to be flexible, and sometimes that means making accommodations that aren't perfect. I did the best I could with a difficult situation." "What made the situation difficult?" "Having extra people at the table, trying to make everyone comfortable, managing the children's expectations." "Extra people?" I interrupted. "I'm not an extra person, Cynthia. I'm Michael's mother. I'm your children's grandmother. I'm family." "Of course you're family," she said quickly. "But you have to understand that this is my home, and I have to consider what works best for my immediate family first." There it was, the hierarchy she'd established in her mind, with Michael and the children as her immediate family, and me as some sort of extended relation whose needs were secondary to their convenience. It was a worldview that positioned her as the gatekeeper of family relationships, the one who decided who belonged where and when. I see, I said. And in your view, what role should I play in this family? You should be involved, of course, but in ways that work for everyone. Maybe we could have you over for lunch sometimes instead of dinner, or you could take the children for afternoons rather than joining us for family meals. There are lots of ways to maintain relationships without creating complicated situations. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. She was offering me crumbs, brief, controlled interactions that would be entirely on her terms, and presenting it as a generous compromise. She wanted me to be grateful for whatever access to my own grandchildren she was willing to grant, to accept my diminished role in the family without complaint. And if I'm not satisfied with those arrangements? Eleanor, I think you need to be realistic about what's reasonable to expect. You're a widow now, and your life has changed. It's natural for family dynamics to evolve, and fighting against that change isn't healthy for anyone. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. She was using Harold's death, my greatest loss and deepest pain, as justification for diminishing my place in the family. She was suggesting that becoming a widow somehow made me less deserving of love and inclusion, that grief should make me grateful for whatever scraps of attention the family was willing to offer. Cynthia, I said, and my voice was steady despite the anger building inside me. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Of course, you owe $18,000 in back mortgage payments. Your house will be in foreclosure within 60 days if that money isn't paid. The company that holds your mortgage belongs to me entirely. I have the power to forgive your debt with a single phone call, or I can let the foreclosure process continue and watch you lose everything you've built. The silence that followed was complete. I could imagine Cynthia's face, the calculations running through her mind, as she tried to figure out how to respond to this information. But more importantly, I continued, I have 2 grandchildren who I love more than my own life, and I will not allow your pride or your need to control every family interaction to cost them their home and their stability. So you'll help us? The relief in her voice was palpable. I'm going to help Emma and Jack. Whether I help you and Michael depends entirely on whether you can demonstrate that you understand what you've done wrong and that you're committed to changing your behavior going forward. Eleanor, I think you're overreacting to what was essentially a seating arrangement. I hung up the phone. Within 10 minutes, my phone rang again. This time it was Michael, and his voice was strained with desperation. Mom, please don't hang up. We need to talk about this reasonably. I'm perfectly willing to talk reasonably, Michael, but reasonable. Conversations start with acknowledging reality, not pretending that making your mother eat Christmas dinner in a garage was a seating arrangement. Okay, you're right. It was wrong. We shouldn't have done it. Can we move past this now? The speed with which he'd moved from denial to acknowledgement to pushing for resolution told me everything I needed to know about his motivations. This wasn't genuine understanding or remorse. This was expedient crisis management. Michael, do you know why it was wrong? Because it hurt your feelings. That's part of it. What else? There was a long pause. Because my mother and you deserve better treatment. And? I don't know what else you want me to say, Mom. I want you to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of 8 years of your wife treating me with increasing disrespect while you stood by and allowed it to happen. I want you to understand that saying you're sorry isn't enough if you haven't actually grasped what you're apologizing for. Mom, please. We're going to lose our house. Emma and Jack are going to lose their home. Can't we work out the personal stuff after we deal with the crisis? And there it was. The assumption that I would prioritize their financial emergency over the emotional damage they'd caused. That money would matter more to me than respect. that solving their immediate problem would make the underlying issues disappear. The personal stuff, as you call it, is exactly why you're in this crisis, Michael. If you'd treated me like family instead of like an inconvenience, if you'd maintained an honest relationship instead of hiding your problems out of pride, if you'd asked for help instead of assuming I couldn't provide it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So what do you want us to do? I want you to think, really think, about the choices you've made, the behavior you've enabled, and the kind of family you want to be. When you've done that thinking, when you're ready to have a real conversation about change, not just apologies, but actual change, then we can talk about your mortgage. I hung up the phone and sat in the gathering evening darkness, feeling simultaneously drained and energized. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth clearly and completely. I had refused to accept less than I deserved, refused to prioritize their comfort over my dignity, refused to enable their poor behavior by rescuing them from its consequences. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The next day was New Year's Eve, and I spent it alone by choice. I could have gone to Margaret's party in Portland, or accepted Mrs. Patterson's invitation to join her family for dinner. Instead, I chose solitude, using the quiet to reflect on the year that was ending and the one that was about to begin. Harold had been gone for 6 months, long enough for the acute grief to settle into something more manageable, but not long enough for me to feel fully adjusted to life without him. I was still learning how to be Eleanor rather than half of Harold and Eleanor, still figuring out who I was when I wasn't defined primarily by my role as someone's wife. The situation with Michael and Cynthia had forced me to confront another identity question. Who was I when I wasn't willing to be the accommodating mother-in-law, the peacekeeper, the one who absorbed family tension without complaint? As midnight approached, I raised a glass of Harold's favorite wine and made myself a promise. This year, I would not accept treatment that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. This year, I would remember that love without respect is not really love at all. This year, I would use whatever power I had, financial, emotional, or otherwise, to create the kind of family relationships that honored everyone involved. The clock struck 12, and I welcomed the new year with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in months. Whatever happened with Michael and Cynthia, whatever decisions they made about their behavior and their future, I knew that I had finally found my voice again. And I intended to use it. January 2nd brought an unexpected snowstorm that blanketed our town in 8 inches of pristine white. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the world transform into something clean and new, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed James Morrison's office number, which surprised me since it was barely past New Year's Day, and most businesses were still closed. Eleanor, I apologize for calling so early in the year, but I've been doing some additional research into your son's situation, and I think you need to know what I've discovered. What kind of research? Financial records, court filings, credit reports, the kinds of documents that paint a complete picture of someone's economic circumstances. What I found goes far beyond what we discussed before Christmas. I settled into Harold's chair, sensing that this conversation was going to require my full attention. Tell me everything. Your son and daughter-in-law aren't just behind on their mortgage payments. They're drowning in debt from multiple sources. Credit cards, a home equity loan, personal loans, even money borrowed from Cynthia's retirement account. The total amount they owe, excluding the original mortgage, is close to $80,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $80,000 in additional debt beyond their mortgage meant they were living a lifestyle that exceeded their income by an enormous margin. This wasn't a temporary setback or a few months of financial strain. This was years of systematic overspending. How is that possible? Michael has a good job and they live modestly. Do they, though? James asked gently. When was the last time you saw their credit card statements or their monthly expenses? Because from what I can tell, modest isn't the word I'd use to describe their spending patterns. Over the next 20 minutes, James walked me through a financial profile that revealed a family living far beyond their means. Private school tuition for both children at $12,000 per year each. 2 car payments on vehicles that cost more than many people's annual salaries. A country club membership, premium cable and internet packages, a housekeeping service that came twice weekly, and regular vacations to expensive destinations. The credit card statements show recurring charges for restaurants, shopping, entertainment, and services that add up to more than most families' entire household budgets, James continued. They're spending money like people who earn twice what Michael actually makes. But how have they managed to keep this going for so long? Credit, lots of it. They've been moving debt around, taking cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on another, borrowing against their home equity to pay off credit cards, then running up the credit cards again. It's a house of cards that was always going to collapse eventually. I thought about the garage Christmas dinner, about Cynthia's indignation when I'd suggested their behavior was inappropriate, about her assumption that I couldn't possibly understand their financial pressures because I lived so modestly. The irony was staggering. While I had been clipping coupons and driving a modest car, they had been spending money they didn't have on luxuries they couldn't afford, all while treating me like a burden they could barely tolerate. There's something else, James said. Court records show that they're facing several other legal challenges. Cynthia's been sued twice in the past year by credit card companies seeking judgments for unpaid balances. There's also a pending lawsuit from their children's former private school over unpaid tuition from last year. Former private school? Emma and Jack were apparently withdrawn mid-semester when the family couldn't keep up with tuition payments. They're now enrolled in public school, but they still owe the private school nearly $15,000. I closed my eyes and tried to process what this meant for my grandchildren. Emma and Jack had been forced to change schools, leave their friends, adjust to a completely new environment, all because their parents had been living a financial fantasy that finally caught up with reality. James, I need you to prepare a complete financial analysis of their situation. I want to know exactly how much they owe, to whom, and what it would take to completely resolve their debt obligations. Eleanor, are you considering paying off all of their debts? Because I have to tell you, $80,000 in consumer debt plus the mortgage arrearages, you're looking at nearly $100,000 total. $100,000. It was a significant sum, but not one that would create any hardship for me. Harold and I could have written that check without thinking twice about it. But the question wasn't whether I could afford to help them. It was whether helping them would actually solve the underlying problem or simply enable more of the same behavior. Prepare the analysis, I said. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I make any decisions. After I hung up with James, I sat in the quiet of my house and tried to reconcile the family I thought I knew with the reality that was emerging. Michael and Cynthia weren't just facing temporary financial difficulties. They were living in a completely unsustainable way, spending money they didn't have on things they didn't need while allowing their children to suffer the consequences of their poor choices. But what bothered me more than their financial irresponsibility was their dishonesty. For years, they had maintained the pretense of being a successful, stable family while secretly drowning in debt. They had accepted monetary gifts from Harold and me for holidays and special occasions, while never mentioning that they were struggling to make basic payments. They had treated me like someone who couldn't possibly understand their modern lifestyle, while living a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive past their house. I told myself I was just getting some fresh air after the snowstorm, but really, I wanted to see their neighborhood with my new understanding of their situation. The houses in their development were indeed beautiful, large, well-maintained, surrounded by professionally landscaped yards that spoke of homeowners who took pride in their appearance. But as I drove slowly down their street, I began to notice details I'd missed before. Several houses had for sale signs in their yards, and not the hopeful signs of families looking to upgrade. but the desperate signs of people trying to escape. Before foreclosure. One house had obviously been abandoned, with an overgrown yard and newspapers piling up in the driveway. Michael and Cynthia weren't the only family in this neighborhood struggling with debt. They had chosen to live in a community where maintaining appearances required a level of spending that many residents couldn't actually sustain. They had bought into a lifestyle that demanded financial sacrifices they weren't prepared to make. I parked across from their house and watched for a few minutes. The exterior looked perfect, freshly painted, well-maintained, the kind of home that would impress anyone driving by. But knowing what I knew about their financial situation, it felt like looking at a beautiful stage set, all facade with nothing substantial behind it. As I sat there, I saw Cynthia's car pull into the driveway. She got out carrying several shopping bags from expensive stores, her arms full of purchases that represented money they didn't have being spent on things they didn't need. Even in the midst of a financial crisis that threatened their home, she was still shopping as if nothing had changed. That evening, I called Margaret and told her everything James had discovered. Her response was characteristically direct. "Eleanor, this isn't about money. This is about values. Michael and Cynthia have chosen to prioritize image over substance, appearances over reality. Giving them money won't change that. It will just enable them to continue making the same poor choices." But what about Emma and Jack? They didn't choose any of this. They're innocent victims of their parents' poor decisions. And they'll continue to be victims as long as their parents face no real consequences for those decisions. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for children is to let their parents learn from their mistakes, even if it means short-term hardship. Margaret was right, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. I loved Emma and Jack desperately, and the thought of them losing their home, changing schools again, facing the instability that comes with parents who can't manage their finances responsibly, broke my heart. But I also knew that simply writing a check to solve their immediate problem wouldn't address the underlying issues. Michael and Cynthia needed to understand that their choices had consequences, that living beyond their means wasn't sustainable, and that treating family members poorly while expecting their help was neither reasonable nor acceptable. On January 5th, I received another text from Michael. "Mom, we really need to talk. The kids are asking questions about why Grandma Eleanor hasn't been around, and I don't know what to tell them." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tell them the truth, that you haven't treated me with the respect that family members deserve, and that I'm waiting for you to demonstrate that you understand why that needs to change." His response came quickly. "Can't we just put this behind us? Life is too short to hold grudges." This isn't about holding grudges, Michael. This is about establishing boundaries and expectations for how family members treat each other. If you're not willing to acknowledge what went wrong, there's no reason to believe it won't happen again. The next day, I received a surprise visitor. Emma and Jack appeared at my door with Mrs. Patterson, who explained that she'd found them walking down the street in the cold, heading toward my house. "Grandma Eleanor," Emma said as I bundled them inside and helped them out of their coats, "Mommy and Daddy said we can't come see you anymore because you're mad at them. But we miss you, and we don't understand why grown-ups have to make everything so complicated." Jack, quieter than his sister but equally perplexed, added, "Are you really going to make us move out of our house?" The directness of their questions, the confusion and worry in their young faces, nearly broke my resolve. These children were caught in the middle of an adult conflict they didn't understand, facing consequences for choices they hadn't made. "Come sit with me," I said, leading them to the living room where Harold and I had spent so many quiet evenings together. "I want to explain what's happening, but I need you to listen carefully and ask questions if you don't understand something." For the next hour, I talked with Emma and Jack about family relationships, about respect and kindness, about the difference between being mad at someone and wanting them to do better. I explained that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people's feelings And that when that happens, it's important for everyone to talk about it and figure out how to make things better. But are we going to lose our house? Jack asked again, his 8-year-old mind focused on the most immediate and frightening possibility. I don't want you to lose your house, I said honestly. But whether that happens depends on choices your parents make, not on anything you've done or failed to do. Sometimes adults have to learn from their mistakes, and that can be scary for children. But no matter what happens with the house, you will always be loved and taken care of. Emma, with the perceptiveness that had struck me before, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. If you can help us keep our house, why don't you just do it? Because, I said carefully, sometimes helping people means letting them figure out how to solve their own problems. If I fix everything for your parents without them understanding what went wrong, they might make the same mistakes again. And that wouldn't really be helping anyone. But it would help us, Jack pointed out with irrefutable child logic. In the short term, yes. But in the long term, you need parents who make good decisions and treat people with kindness. Sometimes, it takes difficult experiences for adults to learn how to do that. After Mrs. Patterson returned the children to their parents, I spent the evening wrestling with the competing demands of my love for my grandchildren and my determination to establish healthy boundaries with their parents. Every instinct I had as a grandmother wanted to solve their immediate problem to ensure that Emma and Jack didn't have to face displacement and uncertainty. But every lesson I'd learned from 47 years of marriage to Harold, every principle that had guided our business decisions and personal relationships, told me that enabling poor behavior by removing its consequences was ultimately more harmful than helpful. That night I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I called Michael and asked him to come to my house alone. I specified that Cynthia should not accompany him, that this conversation needed to happen between just the two of us. He arrived within an hour, looking haggard and desperate in a way that reminded me painfully of how Harold had looked during his final illness. Mom, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm hoping we can work this out. Sit down, Michael. We need to have a conversation that's long overdue. He settled into the chair across from me, the same chair where he'd sat as a child when we'd discussed his homework or his problems at school. But this wasn't a conversation between a parent and child. This was a conversation between two adults about the fundamental principles that should govern family relationships. Michael, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them honestly. Not the answers you think I want to hear, not the answers that will get you what you need, but the truth. He nodded, though I could see the wariness in his eyes. Do you believe that making me eat Christmas dinner in your garage was appropriate? No, he said without hesitation. It was wrong, and I should have stopped it from happening. Why didn't you? The question hung in the air between us, and I watched Michael struggle with an answer that would be both honest and not completely damning of his wife. Because I was afraid, he said finally. Afraid of the fight it would cause, afraid of making Cynthia more upset than she already was, afraid of creating more conflict in a house that already felt like it was falling apart. So, you chose to sacrifice my dignity to avoid conflict with your wife. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible. It was terrible, Michael. And it wasn't an isolated incident. For 8 years, I've watched Cynthia find ways to exclude me, diminish me, and treat me as an inconvenience. And you've enabled it every time by refusing to stand up for what's right. Michael was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him processing not just my words, but the memories they triggered. I could see him beginning to recognize the pattern that I'd been blind to for so long. You're right, he said quietly. I've been a coward. I've let Cynthia treat you poorly because it was easier than dealing with the consequences of confronting her. I've failed as a son, and I've failed as a man. The admission was more than I'd expected, more honest and self-aware than anything. he'd said since this crisis began. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to the son Harold and I had raised, the boy who had been taught to take responsibility for his actions and to treat others with respect. Michael, I need you to understand something. Your financial problems didn't start with missed mortgage payments. They started with a decision to live beyond your means, to prioritize appearances over reality, to spend money you didn't have on things you didn't need. I know that now. But at the time, it felt like we were just trying to give our kids the best life possible, trying to fit in with the other families in our neighborhood. And how has that worked out for you? The question was harsh, but necessary. Michael needed to confront the reality that his choices had led directly to the crisis his family was now facing. It's been a disaster. We've lost everything that really matters while chasing things that don't matter at all. Emma and Jack have been forced to change schools. They're worried about losing their home, and they're living with parents who are constantly stressed and arguing about money. And Cynthia? Does she understand the connection between your spending and your current situation? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Cynthia thinks our problems are temporary, that if we can just get through this rough patch, everything will go back to normal. She doesn't want to change our lifestyle. She wants to find a way to maintain it. That answer told me everything I needed to know about the likelihood of lasting change in their family dynamic. Cynthia saw their financial crisis as a temporary inconvenience rather than a wake-up call, a problem to be solved rather than a consequence to be learned from. Michael, I'm going to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. I have the resources to solve all of your financial problems. I could pay off your mortgage, your credit cards, your personal loans, and every other debt you've accumulated. I could write a check today that would give your family a completely fresh start. Hope flashed in his eyes, quickly followed by wariness as he waited for the inevitable, but I'm not going to do that. The words hit him like a physical blow. I could see the desperation, the disbelief, the anger that cycled through his expression as he processed what I'd said. Mom, please. Emma and Jack don't deserve to suffer because of the mistakes Cynthia and I have made. You're absolutely right. They don't deserve to suffer. But they also don't deserve to continue living with parents who refuse to learn from their mistakes, who treat family members poorly, and who prioritize maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle over providing real stability and security. So what are you saying? That you're going to let us lose everything? I'm saying that I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove that you've learned from this experience and that you're committed to real change. Not just financial change, but fundamental changes in how you treat people and what you prioritize in your life. I pulled out a folder that contained the proposal I'd spent the previous evening preparing. I'm offering you a loan, not a gift. I will lend you enough money to bring your mortgage current and to pay off your most pressing debts, approximately $50,000. The loan will be interest-free, but it comes with conditions. Michael looked at the papers I'd placed in front of him, scanning the terms I'd outlined in careful detail. First, you and Cynthia will attend financial counseling for at least 6 months to learn how to live within your means and manage money responsibly. Second, you will downsize your lifestyle dramatically. No more private schools, no more country club membership, no more spending money you don't have on things you don't need. Third, you will both attend family counseling to address the underlying issues that led to this crisis and to learn how to communicate and resolve conflicts in healthy ways. And if we don't agree to these conditions, then you'll face the consequences of your choices without my assistance. You'll lose your house, damage your credit, and learn the hard way that actions have consequences. Michael stared at the papers for several minutes, and I could see him struggling with the reality that I wasn't offering the easy solution he'd been hoping for. There's one more condition, I said quietly. Cynthia will write me a letter of apology, acknowledging specifically what she's done wrong and committing to changing her behavior going forward. Not a generic, I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt, but a real apology that demonstrates understanding of the harm she's caused. Mom, I don't know if she'll do that. Cynthia doesn't see herself as the villain in this situation. Then she'll need to decide what's more important, her pride or her children's home. Michael took the papers with him when he left, promising to discuss the proposal with Cynthia and get back to me within 48 hours. I watched him drive away and wondered whether this would be the moment when my family chose growth over comfort, responsibility over denial, genuine change over superficial solutions. 2 days later, I received a phone call from Cynthia. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger, and she dispensed with any pretense of pleasantness. Eleanor, I've reviewed your proposal, and I have to say I'm shocked by how vindictive and controlling it is. You're using our financial crisis to force us to submit to your judgment about how we should live our lives. I'm offering you a way to solve your financial problems while addressing the underlying issues that created them. If you find that vindictive, perhaps you should examine why the idea of living within your means and treating family members with respect feels like punishment to you. We don't need counseling, and we don't need you dictating how we spend our money or raise our children. What we need is financial help to get through a temporary rough patch. This isn't a temporary rough patch, Cynthia. This is the inevitable result of years of poor choices and irresponsible behavior. And it will happen again unless you make fundamental changes in how you approach money and relationships. I'm not going to grovel for your forgiveness over a seating arrangement that you've blown completely out of proportion. There it was, even facing the loss of her home, even knowing that her children might be displaced, Cynthia couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that making me eat Christmas dinner in a garage was wrong. She was still minimizing, still deflecting, still refusing to take responsibility for her actions. Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss, I said. Wait, she said quickly, and I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. Maybe we can negotiate some of the terms. Maybe we could agree to financial counseling but skip the family therapy. The terms aren't negotiable, Cynthia. They're a package deal, designed to address all of the issues that led to this crisis. You can accept them or reject them, but you can't pick and choose the parts you're comfortable with. This is blackmail. This is a choice. You can choose pride over your children's welfare, or you can choose to do the hard work of changing the patterns that got you into this situation. But you can't choose to continue the same behavior while expecting different results. The conversation ended with Cynthia hanging up on me, and I knew that she would spend the next several hours trying to convince Michael that my terms were unreasonable, that there had to be another way, that I was being cruel and manipulative. But I also knew that reality has a way of clarifying priorities. When people are facing the loss of their home, when their children are asking questions they can't answer, when the consequences of their choices become unavoidable, they often discover that their pride is less important than their security. 3 days later, Michael called me back. His voice was subdued, and I could hear exhaustion and defeat in every word. Mom, we accept your terms, all of them. Cynthia will write the apology letter, will attend counseling, and will make the lifestyle changes you've outlined. And Cynthia agrees to this? She doesn't like it, but she understands that we don't have any other options. She's realized that losing our house would be worse than swallowing her pride. Michael, I need you to understand that this isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about creating a foundation for healthier relationships and more responsible choices going forward. If you approach counseling and lifestyle changes as something you're being forced to do rather than something you're choosing to do for your family's benefit, they won't be effective. I understand. And Mom? I'm sorry. I'm sorry for allowing Cynthia to treat you poorly. I'm sorry for lying to you about our situation, and I'm sorry for failing to be the son and father I should have been. The apology was everything I'd been waiting to hear. Specific, heartfelt, and focused on behavior rather than hurt feelings. For the first time since Christmas Day, I felt like I was talking to the son I'd raised. Apology accepted, Now let's focus on moving forward in a way that honors the lessons you've learned from this experience. Over the next week, I worked with James to structure the loan and establish the framework for monitoring Michael and Cynthia's progress with counseling and lifestyle changes. The agreement was detailed and comprehensive, designed to ensure that they couldn't simply accept my help and then revert to their previous patterns of behavior. Cynthia's apology letter arrived 3 days later, and while it was clearly written through gritted teeth, it did acknowledge the specific ways she had excluded and disrespected me over the years. She admitted that making me eat in the garage was inappropriate and hurtful, and she committed to treating you with the respect and consideration that family members deserve. It wasn't the most gracious apology I'd ever received, but it was honest and specific, and it demonstrated at least some understanding of what she'd done wrong. The loan was finalized on a Tuesday morning in late January. I transferred $50,000 to an account controlled by James, who would disperse the funds to Michael and Cynthia's creditors according to the schedule we'd established. Their mortgage was brought current, their most pressing credit card debts were paid off, and they were given a genuine fresh start. But more importantly, they were enrolled in financial counseling with a respected firm that specialized in helping families recover from debt crises. They were also scheduled to begin family therapy with a counselor who had experience dealing with family dynamics and communication issues. The most visible change was in their lifestyle. Emma and Jack remained in public school, and while they initially mourned the loss of their private school friends, they quickly adapted and began to thrive in their new environment. The country club membership was canceled, the housekeeping service was discontinued, and Cynthia traded her luxury car for a reliable used vehicle. But the most significant change was in how they treated me. For the first time in years, I was included in family dinners as an honored guest rather than an obligation. Cynthia, while not exactly warm, was respectful and considerate. Michael seemed more relaxed, more like the man I remembered from before financial stress had consumed his life. The counseling was working. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but genuinely. Michael and Cynthia were learning to communicate about money without fighting, to make decisions based on their actual income rather than their aspirations, and to prioritize their children's genuine needs over their own desire to maintain appearances. 6 months after Christmas Day, we celebrated Emma's 9th birthday with a simple party in their backyard. No expensive entertainment, no elaborate decorations, just family and a few close friends sharing cake and watching Emma open presents that had been chosen with care rather than purchased with credit cards. As I sat at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd once been deemed unworthy of a place, watching my granddaughter blow out her candles, I reflected on the journey we'd all taken to get to this moment. The crisis that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately been a gift. It had forced all of us to examine our priorities, our values, and our relationships. It had required Michael and Cynthia to face the consequences of their choices and to make fundamental changes in how they approached money and family. Most importantly, it had taught me that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's enablement. By refusing to rescue them from the consequences of their poor choices, by demanding real change rather than accepting superficial apologies, I had helped them build a foundation for genuine stability and healthy relationships. After the party, as I was getting ready to leave, Emma hugged me tightly and whispered, "Grandma Eleanor, I'm glad you made Mommy and Daddy learn how to be better. Our family is happier now." The wisdom of children, I thought as I drove home through the warm summer evening. Sometimes it takes the perspective of someone who hasn't yet learned to accept dysfunction as normal to see the truth clearly. Harold would have been proud of the choice I'd made, the line I'd drawn, the lessons I'd insisted our family learn. He always believed that the most loving thing you could do for someone was to help them become the best version of themselves, even when that required difficult conversations and temporary hardship. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. I had weathered the storm, stood firm in my convictions, and emerged with a family that was stronger, healthier, and more genuine than it had been in years. The garage Christmas dinner that had seemed like such a cruel humiliation had ultimately been the catalyst for transformation. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the doorways to our greatest growth, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept less than we deserve. I walked into my house, poured myself a glass of Harold's favorite wine, and raised it in a toast to second chances, hard-earned wisdom, and the courage to demand better from the people we love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right? On your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.